The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Welcome, everybody, today. Good morning or afternoon, depending on what kind of time zone you're joining us with. Today, we are going to go into an introduction to Apex, mostly for programmers. And before we get too awful ahead of ourselves, we do need to go through the safe harbor statement. If you haven't seen this before, it basically just says if you're going to make any purchasing decisions, please make them based on current features and not any future-looking statements that myself or Leanne might make. So let me introduce ourselves. My name is Joshua Burke. I'm a developer evangelist here at Salesforce.com. You can catch me on the Twitters today, or Twitters at Josh Burke, and I am joined today by Leanne Templeman, a new addition to our developer evangelist team. And Leanne, why don't you introduce yourself to the crowd?
Thank you, Josh. My name is Leanne Templeman, as Josh said. I'm new to the team, but not new to Salesforce. I've been here about 5 years, and my focus is on working with our declarative developers. So I'm going to be talking about point-and-click functionality, where that fits in with the Apex world. And you can find me on Twitter at LeAndroid.
And as Leanne said, she's going to kind of keep us honest a little bit today. We are mostly going to be focusing on the programmatic side of the platform, but we do not want, especially people who are coming to the platform fresh and new, want you to know about both halves of what the Salesforce1 Platform can do. So if you would like to join us on the social media channel of your choice, we are on Twitter. Our official account is force.com. You can give us a shout out during this webinar using the hashtag ForceWebinar. We will try to keep an eye on that. We also have a Facebook page, a Google Plus circle, a YouTube channel, and a LinkedIn group. I think I got all of those nouns correct and everything. Now, if you have any questions during the webinar, we do have panelists available to try to answer your questions in real time. Just go to the panel that is down in the lower right corner. Ask your questions there. The panelists will try to get to them as the questions come through. They will also be submitting them back to Leanne and myself, and we will take about 5 to 10 minutes, I think we'll have in the schedule, towards the end of the webinar to answer your questions specifically. And then after the webinar, we usually publish an FAQ as well. So if we really just don't get to your questions, you can check developer.force.com later after the show. All right, our agenda today. We're going to be talking about what is Apex. When I say the word Apex, what exactly do I mean? What is the programmatic language? What does it look like? How you can develop Apex within your browser using our developer console. We are going to do a deeper dive into two of the most common use cases for Apex, one being controllers, and then the other one is our event-based logic called Apex triggers. And then finally, I'm going to do an overview of some of the other Apex use cases that might come up, even if we don't have time today to really dig into some of the code samples for those. But before we get really digging deep into the programmatic side, I do kind of want to introduce the concept, the other concept that we have on the Salesforce1 Platform, declarative applications. Now, Leanne, this is something you have a lot of experience with. So when I say declarative app, what does that mean to you? What should the crowd think of when I say declarative app?
So fundamentally, when we talk about declarative apps in Salesforce, we're talking about rules, data models, schema that you can build using point and click. So we'll be touching on that a little bit throughout the webinar today, but if that is kind of your wheelhouse today, if you are working in our declarative world and you're interested from a non-programmatic background and getting into Apex, we will have an upcoming webinar for non-programmers to get started in Apex.
Exactly. So if the declarative world is something you're familiar with, we will be accomplishing that in an upcoming webinar. Feel free to keep on the line. We're not saying don't go anywhere. You may still get some of the advantages of knowing what Apex can do, and we will also be bringing up the declarative examples as we go through. Now, as we are going through this is just sort of a cheat sheet. We have these two sides of the coin when it comes to our platform. On the right side, we see the programmatic. We're going to be focusing mostly on the center section here, the Apex controllers and the triggers. And then as we go through some of these examples, Leanne's going to give us a little bit of a description of some of the things that we see on the left here. Okay, so let's get to the meat of it. What is Apex? When I say Apex, what exactly do I mean? Apex is an object-oriented language, so if you are coming to us from a Java or C# world, it's going to become very familiar to you very quickly. It uses the dot notation syntax, so even honestly, if you're coming to us from, say, a JavaScript world or anything that is using that kind of common C, C++ syntax to it, it's going to look like a language that you really kind of already know how to use. But it is very specific because it is developed, compiled, and deployed in the cloud. As you're going to see today, we can do everything we need to do with Apex right within my web browser, because all I need to do is be logged into my Salesforce instance, and I can have access to Apex, and I can access to developing Apex. You can use your own third-party developer environment. If you're an Eclipse person or a Sublime person, for instance, you can use our APIs to connect back to your instance and still code into that IDE of choice. It is also what I like to call a first-class citizen on the platform. And what I mean by that is because it is running directly within our instance, it has direct access to everything that you are deploying on your org. And we're going to take a look at some very specific examples of that as we go through the webinar. Now, for those of us who may be very new to the Salesforce1 platform, there's kind of a big distinction to coding in Apex as opposed to what you might be used to when it comes to coding in, say, Java or C#. When you're coding a web application in a language like Java, you are probably talking to a third-party database of some kind. You are probably connecting to it with a driver like JDBC, and you have this kind of bridge that is built over to your data model. With the Salesforce1 platform, every object, every field, and so when I say object and field, that is how we have kind of described our database, our data model. So you can translate that roughly to database table and database column. And as I am creating my custom data model, it is automatically enabled within Apex and Visualforce. So what we're going to see, this is what I mean by being a first-class citizen on our platform, is that we can define our data model, and then we can instantly start programming it against it using Apex. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what an Apex class structure actually looks like. And like I keep saying, if you're used to an OO-related language like Java or C#, this is probably instantly familiar to you. You see we have a class. This one's named MyControllerExtension. You can see that we support interfaces, so I'm implementing the util interface here. I can scope my class. This one is scoped to public. It could also be scoped to either private or global. And then I also support those kind of scoped, strongly typed variables in my code as well. So we see a private final account, we see a public contact, and the data types here are referring specifically to the kinds of data structures that we're going to see within the Salesforce1 platform. So when I talk about account and contact, these are what we like to call standard objects. Standard objects are things that we get for free when we're looking at our CRM products, so those are the accounts, the contacts, the opportunities, but we can also extend that to what we call custom objects. And custom objects, we're going to see some examples of that in the demo work that I've got today. For instance, we have a warehouse application, and we've created our own data model in order to manage our warehouse, and we'll see some examples of using that data model as well. Now I have this method here, associate new contact, and it's doing an example of exactly what I'm talking about when I say this is a first-class citizen. So new contact is being brought back from our database using what we call SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language. And SOQL is extremely similar to SQL. If you know the structure and the format of SQL, you'll be able to pick up SOQL very quickly. I can query against my records without any additional configuration, without any additional administration, and I can bring that into Apex, and then I can modify it. In this case, I'm associating a different account with this contact, and then I can update my database using what we call DML, Database Manipulation Language. And so with DML, I can do insert, update, delete, and upsert. And upsert is a combined verb. Upsert allows me to do both an update and an insert, so I can do this against one record, or I can do this against an array of records. And if I'm working against an array of records, then if some of those records have IDs, then it will update those, and if some of the records don't have IDs, then it will insert those. So DML is a very quick and powerful way for us to manipulate our data within Salesforce right here within Apex itself. So how easy is it to code Apex? How easy is it to kind of get up and running with this language? Well, everybody who's on the webinar today should already have a developer edition, or you got it as part of your registration with the webinar. In every one of your developer edition accounts, you also have access to our developer console. And our developer console is a browser-based editor. It allows me to create and edit both classes and triggers. I can also do actually Visualforce pages, which we'll see a demonstration of here today. I can run my unit tasks. I can debug my code and see what's going on. So it's a very feature-complete editor that allows me to create and modify my Apex right here in the cloud, right here using browsers. So it's very easy to get up and running with Apex because the developer edition is free and doesn't expire, and I don't have to download any additional software. I don't have to download an SDK or a compiler or anything like that in order to get up and running with Apex. I can do it right from my browser. But let's not look at just a screenshot. Let's actually see what this looks like within a developer edition environment. So here, I've logged into a developer edition. I've got my tabs up here on the top. My tabs are going to allow me to dig down into data. So for instance, I also have this garage manager, and I can dig down into my garage manager. I can see some of my records. But let's say that I wanted to go ahead and start manipulating some of the stuff using Apex itself. What I can do is I can go up here to where my name is. We can see that I've got a couple of selections, and one is developer console. And developer console will come up here in a brand new window and allows me to either create new classes or other kinds of structures like triggers and pages, and we'll get into a little bit of Visualforce here today, or I can open existing ones. So I can browse the classes that I have currently here within the instance that I'm logged into. But I'm going to close this out because the other thing I want to show you within Developer Console is this ability to run what we call anonymous Apex. So I have this open and execute anonymous window, and if I open this up, we see that I've got this little console here, and what that allows me to do is it actually allows me to run, we call it anonymous Apex, but another way to describe it would be system level Apex. So whatever I put into this little window here, so let's do a quick query, and I'm going to use that custom object we just glanced at, garage, and you can see that, so it's strongly typed to garage. It's got this underscore C, that is how we actually append that to all of our custom objects and fields. I'll give the variable a name, and then we can get a quick list of them here. And Apex also supports a bunch of system level commands, one of them being debug. So if I want to see what's going on with my list here, what I can do is I can say garage's name. And we'll apply a little bit of string here. Now a quick little quirk of Apex, you'll notice here I'm actually using single quotes within the language itself. It actually only supports single quotes. You'll have to escape double quotes out for strings and things like that. I'm constantly trying to use double quotes because I'm jumping in from Apex from some other language. And we can say my name is, and when I execute, so it's now executed that against the system, and you can see down here I am in the logs tab. That log has showed up. It says that it's unread, so I'm going to double click into it. And when I look into a debug log within Developer Console, I mostly get right off the bat what I get is kind of like the full spread of information, right? It's showing me everything that's doing from heap allocations, variable assignments. But in this case, what I really want to do is I just want to see my debug statement here. So what I can do is I can hit debug only, and it will filter down to only things that have debug within. So it's only the user debug events. And so now I can double click here. We see my debug statement. I've got this garage here, the Illinois State garage. But if I wanted to manipulate a little bit of information, so here, let's open back the window. And what I can do is I can actually say, what we can do is we can create a brand new garage. So let's see, garage G equals new garage see. And this has two required fields to it. One is name, and so we will say new garage there. And then the other one is actually, it has this custom field called hour due, and this one actually vehicles are due back. So it's a 24-hour slot. And then what I can do is I can insert G, and we'll do a separate system debug, which is my new garage ID is, we'll do GID. Now, since we've used DML to insert the record, once this is executed, if it's executed properly, it should have a valid ID. So now I'm going to go ahead and click this open log so we can quickly open the log right after we run it. We can run through. We can see a little bit of what's going on here. And if we hit debug only, we see that we've hit both of our debug statements. Our second ID is being displayed here. I can double click. I can hit OK. Let's go ahead and close out of our developer console. And then using the standard URL format for Salesforce, where I can just slap that ID in here, and what we'll do is it will instantly go to my record view. So I've created a brand new garage. I've done it right within Apex. I've done it right here within my browser. Takes just a few minutes. This is actually, I frequently use anonymous Apex in order to do things like create some test data that I actually want to exist in my org, or maybe manipulate some existing records or delete some old test data that I have within my developer edition or things like that. And the execute anonymous is very, very handy for that. Okay, so that's our developer console. So you've got a little bit of an overview of Apex and how it works, what it looks like. So let's look at some more specific use cases as to how we could actually use Apex within our Salesforce1 platform. And this is probably one of the most common use cases, to be quite honest, is as a controller. So Salesforce supports an MVC-style environment. So if we think about our data model as these standard objects and these custom objects that I'm talking about, our view can actually be quite a few things. And if we think back to that slide where we were looking at what's declarative and what's programmatic, we give you many options for what a view is. Now, we're going to look at Visualforce. Visualforce is kind of an advanced, customized user interface. Leanne, we also have a lot of other options. Like, what are some of the standard declarative options people have to create a user interface within Salesforce?
So within when we talk about declarative, again, we're talking about kind of point-and-click functionality that's built into your Salesforce environment for administrators. So we do have options within a visual page layout editor that's available for all Salesforce pages to customize where and how you'd like pages displayed or fields displayed. You also can customize which related items, so we're going to talk about objects in a moment, but which related items you'd like to be shown and what data from those items should be shown and how they should be reflected. And that can all be accomplished with point and click and kind of drag and drop interfaces. When we get into using Visualforce, it's for kind of another layer of customization to determine a customized section on a page, or a more of maybe a slick UI that's very specific if you'd like to have a number of fields represented, you know, in a 4-column layout, things like that. That's when we see people kind of turning to Visualforce to ensure they really have that custom UI.
And we're going to be kind of seeing that declarative side as, you know, we were just kind of clicking into record views and things like that. All of these things we're seeing with the tabs and the page layouts, and you're saying those related lists, these are all things that the admin can customize and really kind of make it sure that they look like the way we want.
Absolutely.
So then when we're kind of beyond that realm, we can use Visualforce, and to drive the logic of Visualforce, we can use an Apex controller. And Apex controllers come in a few different flavors. We're going to look at those flavors, whether they're controllers or extensions. But what I really want to talk about when it comes to Apex are the two different kinds of transport that we have. So when we're talking about transporting data back and forth between the view and the controller, we have two main ways of doing that. And one is through a view state, and then one is through JavaScript. So more specifically, we have JavaScript remoting, and JavaScript remoting has the ability to talk to Apex directly within JavaScript, no view state required. And then we can also use standard Visualforce forms, and those forms do use a view state. And if you're not familiar with the view state, a view state is a hashed bit of information that exists on the client side, basically to keep track of state, which normally does not exist within the HTTP/HTTPS protocol itself. So two very different ways of doing the logic and the binding of the data. So let's take a quick look at the two different types. So let me go back into my developer edition, and I'm going to go back into my developer console. And the first one I want to show is actually the view state model, because this is kind of the traditional when you kind of look at sort of how Visualforce and Apex have usually been used together. This is how we frequently see it. So let me bring up, whoops, that's new. We bring up a class here called Garage Manager. And what this is trying to do is we have vehicles within our garages, and we want to be able to very quickly be able to move that vehicle from one garage to another. So all this class is doing is basically handling that logic. We define the class itself. We've got a couple of publicly scoped variables that we're going to use on our Visualforce page. We have our constructor. Our constructor is bringing in the standard controller. I'm going to describe what that is here in a second. And then we have looped our logic into this method, create new garage. So let's look at the Visualforce page and see how that matches up. So within Visualforce, which is basically a component-based library that allows me to dynamically generate HTML based on data. So if you're used to JSP or ASP, it's a very similar structure to that. It outputs as HTML, so you can see I can mix and match my own HTML. I could do CSS, I could do JavaScript, I can put all of this onto the page. And so I can let Visualforce generate what I want to based on its own components, or I can put my own HTML structures in here. So what I'm doing is I'm defining a form that's going to tell me that I want to talk back to Apex using this section of my Visualforce page. I have a little bit of output text here, which is going to verify what I'm putting out here onto the page, which is in this case this vehicle name. Now how I'm binding this particular data is actually a section where we don't need Apex. I have what we call a standard controller here. The standard controller can point to a specific object type. So in this case, I'm pointing to my custom object vehicle. And a standard controller actually gives us out of the box create, read, update, delete, and query options without having to write any additional Apex code. The concept here is that these are very basic operations that people are going to use over and over and over again against these data types, and we don't want you to have to write a whole bunch of Apex over and over and over again to do what is basically baseline operations against your data. So some of what we're seeing here is coming from our standard controller. So our vehicle name, our vehicle garage name, we're displaying that based on what the standard controller is capable of doing. But in this case, we also want to be able to do this swap over to a brand new garage. And so there we are binding from the garage name variable that we saw in the controller, and then we're going to bind a button back to that create new garage method that we saw in the controller. So I can bind that directly here within Visualforce. If I go back to the controller, you see we have the garage name variable there. And then what I'm doing, you'll notice here, and I think this question came up in the questions panel, what I'm returning here is a page reference data type. What a page reference data type does within the Apex is it controls where the page is going to go after it has gone through this business logic. So we can actually do some AJAX style stuff in Visualforce, and I can return null, which means, hey, stay on the same page that you're at. Or I can tell it after I'm done here, I'm going to have you redirect to a new page, which is what this example will do. So the business logic here is basically taking the keyword, it's looking to see if there's an existing garage. If there is an existing garage, it's going to update my vehicle with that garage, and then it's going to grab the ID of that garage and it's going to return that as the page reference. If it doesn't find anything, it does that exact same thing that we saw within the execute anonymous window. I'm creating a brand new garage. Based on the name, I'm adding the vehicle to that garage, and then I'm giving the page reference of the new garage. So let's close the developer console out here, And let's actually see that in action. Let's go to my garages. And let's go over to Illinois State here. We see that we've got two different vehicles. Let's go to 002 here. What I've done is I've actually bound this Visualforce page to a custom button, which is also part of the declarative side of the platform. I can kind of marry these two things together this way. So I can click on this. It's going to bring my ID over. That ID is going to allow the standard controller to bring in the data that I have. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say brand new garage and hit save. And we can see that we've been brought over to brand new garage, and our vehicle is down here on the related list. It's been now related up to the new parent of garage. Now we have brand new garage that we created there because we put that in specifically. If I wanted to go back to brand new garage and move my vehicle over to Illinois Street, I could just put Illinois Street, and we'll find it based on the like of that, and we can see that Illinois Street now has the 002 there. Unless I accidentally created a new one. Now we actually have two different Illinois streets. So let's do a quick, because I think that will muck up an upcoming demo. Garage, save, and now I have a bug in my code because I'm just creating a bunch of new garages. So we'll keep an eye on that as we're going down the demos. We'll also talk about why unit testing is a good idea later in the webinar, which would have caught this before I was showing the demo itself. Okay, so that is one form. We're looking at the Visualforce forms portion here. That's using the view state. So when we're changing the garages and creating the new garage, that's using the view state to communicate data in between Visualforce and Apex. Now I want to show you this other one here, which is JavaScript promoting. Let's see here. Let's go back into our developer console. Close out our Visualforce forms here. And open, let's start with the Apex side. We go into the Find Nearby controller. And then the associated page is Find Nearby Warehouses. Okay, so Find Nearby. So this controller looks what we've been, same kind of thing. This is actually also being used as an extension. So we're bringing in the standard controller here in the constructor. What I have is I have a static method which has the annotation of remote action. So we also support annotations within Apex. They tell our methods to do very specific things. And in this case, what remote action is saying is that I have a static method, which can be either global or public, depending on the situation. And we're going to expose this method with these incoming parameters to JavaScript directly. So we've got these two params, lat and long. And the operation here is basically doing a geolocation feature within Sockle, which is a relatively new, and actually I think it just got released out of beta in the last release. It's been in beta for a few releases. Geolocation is something which is actually near and dear to my heart. Before we had this as a feature, I wrote several geolocation applications, and doing geolocation applications without some kind of system-level geolocation feature can be daunting. I actually wrote one way back in the day when Apex didn't support sine and cosine, and trying to write radial information or radial data logic when you don't even have geometric functions like that was extremely challenging. So the platform has come a long way in several years, and now instead of having to try to figure out the difference between a corner and a circle, I can just put it right here in Sockle. And so what this is going to do is it's going to take the lat and the long, it's going to look for any warehouses within a 20-mile radius, and then it's going to return the results of that database query. And so if we go into the page itself, what this is doing is it's working with the Google Maps API. So this is a great example of the Google Maps JavaScript API being used within JavaScript within Visualforce. So we've got this nice tight integration, and Visualforce has a remoting manager that allows me to invoke a specific action, and you can see that it matches my class name and then the method name. So our class is being referenced here in our extensions. And because it's referenced there, and because it's been annotated with remote action, I can automatically bring this within JavaScript within Visualforce. I can pass in those two parameters, and what we're going to get back is we're going to get back an asynchronous response. So what we need to do within JavaScript is we need to set up a callback function. The callback function is going to expect two different things. The result is a JSON formatted version of those database records that we got back from our query, and then the event, which can give me additional information. So for instance here, you see it's also looking for both status, and then if the type of the event is exception, that means something went wrong. Maybe my query wasn't formed correctly. Maybe my DML statement wasn't submitted correctly. And so when we get that flow, we can actually look to see what the error was on the Apex side, and we can respond to that within our client here. So we're going to invoke our Apex, we're going to grab those records, and then we're going to actually hand it down to Google so that we can generate our map on the fly. So let's go ahead and close this out, and then I actually have this page set up on a custom tablocation, a custom tab. Did I just call it a custom tablocation? I think we could actually trademark that. Nearby warehouses, and our green spot here is where Leanne and I are currently located here in Chicago, and we have mythically created a warehouse in the middle of the famous Willis Tower, formerly known as the Sears Tower, which would be an extremely expensive location to store any kind of hardware, so probably a pretty fictional clause here. But we can see that we've gone through the process. We've asked Apex what our closest warehouse is, and we're using the Google Maps API to integrate that down here in Visualforce. And we have this nice tight integration with Visualforce and JavaScript. And since there's no view state involved in this, it's a direct transport between JavaScript and Apex. It also means it's very lightweight. There's no overhead of the view state having to be transported back and forth with the messaging itself. So it makes it very nice for working with JavaScript libraries. It's also very appropriate for building out mobile interfaces as well. Okay. One more example. So we've seen the Visualforce forms. We've seen JavaScript remoting. Let's go back into our developer console. And I want to show one more example. This is actually using the Visualforce Forms version. And what I'm going to do is open up this controller here, classes, and this is actually called Flickr Handler. Because this highlights, I think, not only the same kind of thing we're talking about here, that we have the ability to use Apex as a controller down to the view state. We have the ability to actually do some more sophisticated things that I think Java and C# developers are probably familiar with. One thing, I actually have two constructors here. One which is just by itself. If I wanted to use Flickr as its own controller and not use that standard controller that we were seeing before, we have that option. And then I also have a second constructor that will hand in the standard controller, which allows me to use it as both a custom controller or an extension. And then the other thing we're doing, this is the world's easiest HTTP callout because it doesn't require any kind of OAuth. There's no back and forth dance with it. Fortunately, Flickr has a publicly available JSON feed, which allows me to just hit that. And what I'm doing is I'm passing in a tag in order to do a search request for it, grabbing that. And what I'm doing here in Apex is I'm taking that information and I'm serializing it. We have a system-level JSON library. I'm serializing it to this Flickr list, which you see I've defined up here. So I can define my own data type within Apex. I can support that as a class. This is going to match up with the fields that we're seeing within JSON, and then Apex can talk to it directly as its own data type. So it transmits into this very nice, mature way of looking at data, especially JSON data, and also allows us to show this HTTP callout that we have. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. That is, if I go into Sales, I can go into this Flickr view here. And by default, what we're going to see is we're actually going to see San Diego. If we don't give it a tag, we see a San Diego landscape. So apparently there's been a lot of San Diego birds and possibly a San Diego giraffe. This may be somebody's trip to the beach or the zoo. We're bringing this information down. We're translating to Visualforce. We're showing it right here on the page. And then our second thing we can do is we can also add in a tag here. And my favorite tag to show is puppies, because we've done a lot of science here at Salesforce where we get about 10 points better on our webinar survey results if we show at least one cute picture of a puppy. So there's a pretty adorable little puppy there. So when you're giving us our survey results back, have that firmly ingrained into your mind. Okay, so that is Apex controllers. The next big use case that I want to show is Apex triggers. And Apex triggers are quite possibly the second most common use case that we really see Apex being used for. It's an extremely powerful use of Apex on the platform. It's event-based logic that I can associate with an object. So before, say, an account is updated, I can perform a little bit of logic. I could even block that account from being updated based on some business logic that I have in Apex. But Leanne, we also have a couple things within the declarative side which are possible, which are definitely more common use cases for controlling events and controlling the flow of data. What are some of the things that people can do declaratively to kind of control that flow of data and the events as data is being inserted or updated?
So one of the most popular, most widely used tools that we have in Salesforce on the point and click side is called workflow rules. So using workflow, you can create rules and the criteria in which those rules were run, and determine actions that happen when that rule is true. So those actions can be anything from a email alert or notification going to employees of your company or going externally. It could be a field update. We have some ownership and assignment tools as well around like case ownership, lead ownership. So definitely kind of evaluating the workflow rule world as well as things like formula fields and seeing if those fit your use case. I would encourage that prior to delving immediately into Apex, just for the ease of maintenance, ease of use piece. But if you're looking to, say, create a new record when something happens to an object, that is where you'd start to, or one of the many areas in which you'd start to get into Apex territory.
Right, because we're going to see a manipulation of either the data as a whole or a relationship to other data that workflows don't really have visibility into.
Right. There are limits to when we can use workflows. So evaluating workflows and kind of assignment rules and maybe case escalation rules, things like that, kind of as a first stop to see if those meet your needs. Often they will meet at least a few of the needs when it comes to kind of automation within the system, and then figuring out where does Apex fit in after that.
Yeah, and I think it's good to remember, I mean, as programmers, we think in terms that what we're seeing here today, so like the examples that I'm showing, we don't really think of those necessarily in terms of high maintenance. I mean, some of the controllers I'm showing here, they're like 30 lines of code. The testing for those would actually be very trivial. So we think they're probably very lightweight. But when we look at the full ecosystem of a Salesforce application, they're a little bit on the heavier side, especially when compared to a workflow. So I think for a programmer, maybe a conversation with a Salesforce administrator or a business analyst. So I went to a data and / requirements gathering meeting that lasted about 2 hours, and I had this brilliantly complicated trigger all thought out, and I came out and I talked to my business analyst about it, and I told him how long that would take me, and he kind of blinked and he's like, or I could do that 5 minutes with a workflow. Right. So it's important to have that conversation. As programmers, we like to solve things through code, but there may be another solution that's already kind of a lower hanging fruit out there on the platform.
Right, exactly.
So let's look at triggers themselves. Like we're describing, they are event-based, and we can associate them specifically with object types before or after insert, update, delete, or undelete. So let's look at an example of that and talk about it in terms of controlling the flow of the trigger itself. So we define a trigger specifically. You'll notice here it's actually not declared as a class. It's declared as a trigger. We give it its name. We associate it with one kind of object. So in this case, we're associating it with the custom object line item. We can list a series of events, actually. We're listing both before insert and before update. And actually, a lot of people who have used the platform for a while recommend only having one Apex trigger per object, and go ahead and list out a bunch of events, and then do what we're seeing here, which is the ability to control the logic through the flow based on the system level variable of trigger. So depending on what kind of event my logic is anticipating, I can say trigger.is before or trigger.is after, and I can also separate it out based on the events of trigger.is insert and then like trigger.is update. And I can very specifically call out the logic that I want based on these scenarios. This also makes it a little bit, you'll notice very end here, we're actually delegating this logic to another class and another method. It's very handy for me to be able to split out my logic if I think of my trigger being structured this way. Another really kind of quick tip for people who've been programming out there for a while, another thing we can do within triggers, because as they're going through the scope, is going to actually be the same scope of operation, and it's possible for one trigger to reenact an older trigger or workflow to cause a trigger to be caused once or twice or 3 times. And one way I can actually prevent it from being called multiple times, I can set up a static flag within a class, and then I can have that flag being flipped over to true or false depending on how I want to be able to control my trigger as well. So always think of Apex not necessarily as writing one trigger that's going to do one thing. Remember that Apex is object-oriented. It supports all the things that you need in order to kind of properly do these utility methods that we're talking about. Now, the example that I want to show today is chatter triggers. Chatter triggers are a specific kind of trigger that allows us to manipulate chatter information as it is going back and forth on the platform itself. And this is actually, as traditionally we're very used to using triggers for things like accounts and line items and warehouses, using triggers within chatter itself is something that's a use case that's very handy, but a lot of developers aren't necessarily familiar with the fact that we can just go ahead and do this. So let's see an example of that. And if you're not familiar with chatter, I will go ahead and show that as well. Chatter is basically our social framework within the Salesforce1 platform. It's very similar to Facebook and Twitter and a lot of the mechanisms that it uses, but at the same time, it allows us to basically have a conversation about our data. It can also allow us to have our data have a conversation back to us. So as changes occur within our system, then, like, for instance, if I change that vehicle from one garage to another, that data could actually show up within my chatter feed. So somebody who's monitoring that record could actually see that show up within a chatter feed. But one of the things that we've run into when people try to adopt chatter is they're concerned with having this kind of very open conversation across an entire organization. And so what we have is this little App Exchange project that I pulled into my org. Now this is available on App Exchange. It's free. It's an unmanaged package. So if anybody's interested in how this code works or how Apex is working this situation, you can download this right into your developer edition. You can poke around with the code. It's actually one of my favorite examples to give to people to play around with because it's very clean, very well organized code. And what Chatter Blacklist allows us to do is it allows us to perform substitutions on words that are coming through Chatter itself. So what I'm going to do is create a new blacklist word. And what we're going to do is we're going to not let people do too much Twitter-style shorthand because some people think words should be spelled out. So if I do LOL here, I'm going to have the substitution be just laugh out loud. And I have other options. I could also just blank it out with asterisks or things like that. I'm going to go ahead and just save this. And then if I go back into home, we can see my chatter feed here. We can see some of the examples of what I'm talking about with the data sort of having a participation within the feed. Here I've created a delivery object, so that shows up right within my feed. Actions that I've taken on my data show up. And then if I say that I am having an LOL kind of day, this is going to trigger on the insert of that feed item, and it's going to go ahead and do a quick substitution for me. And it's going to show laugh out loud instead. So this is just sort of a trivial example, but it shows you that you can have business logic that's intercepting what's going on within Chatter itself. Other use cases people have used this for instance, you could do a hashtag of convert, and Apex could automatically convert that lead for you within Salesforce. or you could have other actions that are being performed within Apex based not necessarily on somebody pushing a button or going to a specific Visualforce page, but based on a conversation that's actually happening within Chatter itself. Okay, so we are going to now do a quick tour of some of these are slightly more advanced or at least rarer use cases for using Apex, but they're very good to know about. I think once you get your hands around Apex and you really get used to it, it's good to know that you can do these things with Apex so that you don't necessarily go bundle a completely different solution when you could have been doing it natively in Apex in the first place. One of my favorite examples is scheduled Apex. Scheduled Apex allows us to perform business logic on a very specific interval or period. In order to do that, what we do is we have to implement the schedulable interface, and that is going to enforce us of having one method here of execute. And execute is what is going to be called whenever the schedulable class is being called on that period or that interval. And so we can set that up in two different ways. I can actually do it directly within Apex using a cron style format. So if you're familiar with cron, for instance, this 0013 asterisk asterisk question mark that we're seeing here is a fancy way of saying every day at 1 o'clock try to run this Apex. Another thing we can do is we can also just do it through our web UI, which is honestly my favorite way because it just gives me a little bit of more visual oversight into what's going on with Apex itself. This is a very handy tool. I actually use it on one of our internal orgs to go out and check our blog RSS feed 3 times a day. So 3 times a day, I do an HTTP call out to our RSS feed. I check to see if there's anything in that RSS feed that our org doesn't already know about, and it pulls the blogs into our org and then sends everybody out an email. So we get this nice near real-time notification when our team is blogging out there on developer.forge.com. We also have Batch Apex, which is a very close cousin to Schedulable Apex. Batch Apex, I think more of like as an operating line. So with Batch Apex, what I can do is I can throw a large set of records towards it, and with the large set of records, I can just basically churn through those records with some business logic, with some Apex logic, and then tell people what to do at the end of going through that process. So it uses the batchable interface. Batchable brings in 3 methods: start, execute, and finish, and those do exactly what we think they would. So start is when I have sent the scope over to it and I want to do a little bit of prep. Execute is as it's going through the scope of objects, and I can send it a whole bunch of records and then keep running through it. I'll just keep running through it and keep running through it. And then once it's done executing on that scope, it will call finish, and we can do any kind of cleanup that we want. So a classic example here is to clean up old records. I could go through any record that is greater than 30 days old. I could delete it. I can empty out my recycle bin, and then once I'm done, I could send everybody an email and say, hey, I just deleted 30 records from our system. So a very good utility case for Apex. And then another, and this is one that, another one of my favorite features of the platform is Apex endpoints. So when we were looking earlier about how everything is instantly exposed through Visualforce and Apex, another great thing is as we're building out these garages and these warehouses and these custom fields, it's also instantly exposed through our REST API, our SOAP API, our streaming API, our bulk API, our entire family of APIs. And with our REST API out of the box, we get create, read, update, delete, query. There's no additional configuration, administration, or development in order to have a REST API that does that against your data model. But there are situations where you may want to create a very specific flow of business logic and have that attached to a REST endpoint. And with Apex REST, I can do this by annotating a class with REST resource. That is going to have me define the URL mapping that I can find my REST resource. So in this case, it would be like /apex/case management. And then what I can do is I can annotate methods within that class using the HTTP methods themselves. So there's HTTP post, get, delete, put. I feel like I'm forgetting one, but I think that's the family of HTTP methods. And as the methods hit that endpoint, they will be routed directly to the specific methods that we have here. And what you find is that you have functionality that maybe you're already using the out-of-the-box REST API for, where say you query some records, you filter out a few, you update those, you delete a couple more, and then you insert another one. And that's like maybe 6 or 7 different API calls. There are frequently instances where you could actually wrap all of that logic into one flow, and instead of doing 6 or 7 API calls, you could actually get away with just doing one custom REST endpoint and one custom API call. All right, so we've talked about all the fun that we can have with Apex. Let's talk about some of the work that is required in order to use the language within the Salesforce1 platform. One of the key ones is unit testing. With unit testing, I can declare specific classes, code, methods as tests, so they don't count against my overall limits of how much Apex code I can have in my instance, for example. By default, I'm using data which is test only. So this is data that I'm generating within Apex. It's only going to be instantiated for the run of the unit test. It's never actually inserted into my system. And it allows me to create fake data sets, basically, in order to make my assertions from. And then what my assertions do is they basically prove my outcome. Now, earlier today I was having some confusion about how my garage manager code was working. I've been told by some people in the comments that it's actually working exactly how I coded it, not necessarily how it was designed, right? So we've got two different things here, right? My code may not have had any bugs in it. Apex was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing, but maybe my end user's like, you know, what's going on here? Like, this isn't what I expected. So I can set those system assertions up within my unit test. I can create some test data in order to prove what the scenario is going to work through, go through some logic, test against my code, and see if those assertions are going to be met. Unit test is evaluated from development up to production by the number of lines that we are hitting within Apex. So by default, we say that you should hit 75% of the code that you're trying to deploy to production. We highly recommend going much higher than that, because the higher percentage of coverage that you have, the more lines of code, the more if statements and else statements that you're getting into, the higher level of predictability that you'll have, that when you go into production, that your garage manager is actually going to be working as expected, as opposed to necessarily how you're presenting it to 200 people at any given time. Now, we also have governor limits on the Apex platform. I wish I had more time to talk about this. To be quite honest, we could do an entire webinar on this itself. These are system level limits. There are limits on your instance itself. Examples include, like when we're doing those DML calls within one scope of operation, I can have 150 of those. I could do 10 HTTP callouts within one scope of operation. In the Apex workbook that I'm going to have a link towards at the end here, we actually have a whole chapter on this, Chapter 3, Tutorial 13. And let me just kind of give you, this is just a very brief, like, how governor limits kind of affect our code. If we're going to do a DML statement, in this case, this update contacts to update, I want to make sure that I'm doing that DML statement outside of any loops, any iterations that I'm doing through my logic. Because if I put that DML statement inside that loop, it's going to be hit for every record that's in that loop. So if I have 1, it's going to be hit once. If I have 10,000, it's going to be hit 10,000 times. I'm going to bust out those governor limits. So it is something to consider as you are designing your code, that not necessarily everything that you want to do on the platform can be done on an unlimited basis. And there's this great wiki page here, Apex Code Best Practices, which break down a bunch of that kind of stuff that you should probably know about before throwing stuff into production. Okay, let's recap, wrap some stuff, get to some questions. We talked about what Apex is. We showed you the developer console. Once again, you don't have to use the developer console. You can use Eclipse. You can use Sublime. We talked about Apex controllers and gave some very specific examples of that. Showed you Chatter Blacklist as an example of what Apex can do as a trigger. And then we did a quick overview of some of our other Apex use cases. So resources I want everybody to remember, and if you're looking at all these links and you're wondering what's going on here, don't worry, all these slides will be posted back up to developer.force.com about a week or so after today. But you already should have a developer edition you got one for registering for this webinar. If you can't find it or you want another one, you can go to developer.force.com/join. Our developer editions are free. They do not expire. They are not a product trial. They are your playground to learn the platform, learn these languages, and actually start coding your application. The Force.com workbook is a great crash course into learning the platform in general, and we also have a specific workbook for Apex, which includes the example about governor limits I was talking about earlier, and a lot of the things actually that we're talking about today. And then we also have a forum dedicated to questions about Apex, which many of you probably have, and we're going to get to those questions here in a second. But before we get to those, I want to show you the survey link. Please go and fill this out. Your feedback is very important to us. It helps us iterate these programs and make them better over time, which is, I think, literally my mission statement, or it's a sentence somewhere within my mission statement for this job. Okay, so let's get to some of your questions. Where can we get the sample code which is showed in this webinar? So I will follow up with the awesome Lauren Grau, who helps us administrate our webinars, about getting that information out to you. So what we've been seeing today is actually a whole set of demos that I've been producing and reproducing for other purposes. So some of them are publicly available. Some of them are actually part of the Force.com workbook or the Apex workbook. So I would start there. But I am trying to produce an unmanaged package which basically has the whole suite of things that we've been seeing today. So we'll get that out after the show. So what is the advantage of JavaScript remoting? JavaScript remoting, probably the chief advantage of JavaScript, well, two chief advantages. Number one, because it can be executed within JavaScript itself, it makes it very easy to integrate with JavaScript libraries. So for instance, I had actually a blog post recently about using it with a CanJS JavaScript framework, which was something I had tried just for that blog post. And it's very easy to blend it with CanJS because it operates right there within JavaScript. The other nice thing is since the methods up on Apex are static, and we're using a transport to go from JavaScript up to Apex, there's no view state required. And depending on the situation, depending on how much data we're trying to display on a page, that view state can really start to slow down the overall transport between the client and the server. So I've actually seen interfaces which I've redesigned with JavaScript remoting, which have seen somewhere between a 3 to 5 times performance increase, simply because I'm not communicating with that view state anymore. How can I check the test code coverage? Is there another option besides the developer console? Yes, there is. There's actually about 3 that come to mind right off the bat. The developer console is one way in the interface. You can also find it through setup. If you go to setup, developer, or develop Apex, on the classes themselves, if there is a test method being annotated, there's usually a run test button that will show up there, and there's also a run all test button, which will bring you right into the test runner within setup itself. So setup has one. You can also use both Eclipse and Sublime, both of those, and the Sublime is actually using the wonderful Maven's Mate plugin. When I'm saying Sublime, that's actually what I'm talking about. And the wonderful Maven's Mate plugin has a unit test interface, and Eclipse has a unit test interface as well. Are Apex triggers applied to methods? So it's kind of interesting the way triggers are set up, because triggers operate as a class which basically kind of get up and running. So when we think about methods within triggers, what I want you to think about is that delegate class example that we were looking at before. So I think it's very good to think about it in terms of methods, put those methods onto a delegate class, and then when we're looking at that, controlling that flow, you hit the delegate class and you hit the method within the delegate class. I think that helps format a trigger in a way that a lot of programmers are a little bit more comfortable with seeing from a code point of view. What is code coverage? So I did kind of jabber on about unit testing without really describing unit testing. Unit testing is code that's going to test your code, which means that I might have a bit of code which calls, say, that Flickr method which did the HTTP call out. And my code, when it hits that method, will run through, say, 5 lines of that method. Maybe it skips 3 because those 3 are an if statement that wasn't covered in my test data. So in that case, I've covered 5 lines and I haven't covered 3. So out of that method, I'm hitting about like 80% of code coverage or something like that. So it's overall lines of code that we're hitting within our unit test. Let's see. Using JavaScript remoting, can we integrate Salesforce data into a non-SFDC page, for example, an external CMS? No. And the reason is because JavaScript remoting, the way it gets through that whole trick of not using a view state or anything else, it's actually running in the same scope that Visualforce is. And the distinction there is that means JavaScript remoting is not working within the API scope. So the only reason it gets away with that is because it's running as a, kind of like Apex as a first-class citizen, it's also operating as a first-class citizen within our platform. So you can, however, integrate JavaScript from a third-party page, say something that's hosted on a different environment. But what you would do is you would use JavaScript to do API callouts in that case. And there's actually a great library by the wonderful Pat Patterson called ForceTK. We use ForceTK in a lot of our mobile packs, for instance. And that can allow you to use JavaScript directly, and then you just use a proxy and you access our API and you bring information out. Besides insert, update, delete, and undelete triggers, there is also upsert and merge triggers. When are those fired? I am going to have to. I'm going to pitch that one to Leanne. Actually, no, she's sorry. She's giving me this look of please, please do not ask me this question. I will have to take that back to a little bit of research. I have actually not run into those triggers myself. Upsert, I'm going to guess, will trigger over both either insert or update. I have not run into that because usually I split it out between both insert and update, which effectively does the same thing. And I will try to promise to get this one into the FAQ that we publish after the webinar. Can 2 different custom controllers share the same view state? This is an excellent question. I really like this question. Yes, they can. And I'm going to answer this actually in 2 different ways. One is that when we saw that page reference return, one of the things that page reference has as an option is how it redirects. And one of the things that it can do is it can redirect to another page, but it can maintain the same view state. So you could actually go from one custom controller to another custom controller and maintain the same view state using and I believe it is redirect. I believe it is redirect false. The client will see a redirect, but the server side view state remains the same. The other thing to kind of, and I just want to make sure I'm covering both sides of this, you can also have multiple extensions. So if you have multiple classes that want to look at the same page at the same time, you can actually chain extensions as well. So extensions is plural, and we can have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 extensions which are all looking at the same page at the same time. Will JavaScript remoting handle session expire? Yes. JavaScript remoting, basically it is using, I can't get into the technical data of it, not because we don't have enough time, but because I'm not smart enough to actually understand it. But we basically are using what's called the CSRF token to maintain the session at that point, and that session will expire as well as the user when the user's session expires, not the user themselves. We're hoping our users don't expire just by using JavaScript remoting. How would your user refer or execute a function with a controller extension inside the run anonymous Apex? The easiest way to do that is actually so you can actually instantiate an Apex class. So if it's an Apex, remember back I had that Flickr handler class, and it had 2 constructors, and one was accepting a standard controller, and the other one was not accepting a standard controller. Easiest way is to do a constructor like that, because then you don't have to try to construct a standard controller on the fly within execute anonymous, and then you can instantiate a version of that extension, and then you can call the methods from your instantiated version. What was the option other than the developer console in Eclipse? So once again, and I would highly recommend looking at Maven's Mate. which is a plugin for Sublime, so it operates on both Windows and Macintosh. It's actually kind of my developer edition of choice, or developer environment of choice at the moment. Very nice and lightweight, very fast to use against our platform. Okay, so we are actually 5 minutes after the bell, so I think it's probably an excellent time to say goodbye. I've had an excellent time today. Leanne, thank you for joining me and reminding me of all these wonderful declarative things that we can do even as a programmer.